Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Karen Yarhimilo. I'm the Dean of the School of International Public Affairs and the Adlai Stevenson Professor of International Relations. We are living in an age of revolution, a time of profound upheaval and rapid technological disruptions in which the norms, the rules, the systems we've long lived by are being challenged, they're being rewritten. That is the thesis of one of our speakers today, and I would expect nothing less thought-provoking from Fareed Zakaria. In his book, Age of Revolutions, Progress and Backlash from 1600 to the Present, Fareed challenges his readers to reconceptualize their impressions of what a revolution means. Revolutions are intellectual as much as they are social or political. No shots need to be fired, no rulers to be slayed. Just as Copernicus radically altered our understanding of the cosmos back in 1543, the revolutions we're living through today represents a fundamental reordering of how we live and how we think about the world and of our societies writ large. A rising China and a resurgent Russia are challenging the rule-based order. Technological breakthroughs on AI from the private sector are not only altering how we accomplish simple tasks like sending emails or writing an essay for class, but also how companies and countries structure themselves. All this disruption and polarization is also leading to a revolution around notions of social identity, which will have its own ripple effects, and we're seeing some of it already. Fareed calls it a world in overdrive. We all look forward to hearing more, and this is the topic of today's conversations. So let me now introduce today's featured speakers. Fareed is a world-renowned author, the anchor of CNN's flagship international news shows, Fareed Zakaria's GPS, and the author of, honestly, too many best-selling books to mention here, but one of the things, for example, he coined the phrase rise of the rest, when he foresaw over a decade ago the current challenges we would face from emerging countries and economies, and his latest work, which we're about to hear today, has been described by journalist Walter Isaacson as the indispensable book for understanding the world today. And I read the book last week, and I could not agree more. I highly, highly recommend this to all of our students, to faculty in our community at large. There are passages in the book that still stayed with me, and I'm wrestling through some of the questions that Fareed poses, especially the last chapter of this book. And I'm also thrilled to welcome back Eric Schmidt. In addition to being the former CEO and chairman of Google and co-founder with his wife, Wendy, of the Schmidt Sciences, Eric is a member of the IGP's inaugural cohort of Carnegie Distinguished Fellows. And we are very honored to have Eric among our cohort this year, and he's an accomplished technologist, entrepreneur, and philanthropist. And by the way, if you haven't yet had a chance to watch our event from last week on the role of AI and the threat AI poses to the 2024 global elections, you should absolutely do so. You should take 30 minutes to listen, especially to his conversation with Secretary Clinton, which was highly insightful and includes a great call for action at the end. So I highly recommend you look back and think about the insights from that session. Eric is also the author and co-author of many best-selling books, including The Age of AI and Our Human Future with the late Henry Kissinger and Daniel Hattenlocker, and he and his co-authors also wrote a provocative piece in The Atlantic on the potential harms of AI. And I'm very curious to see if our speakers agree with one another. That's one of the things I look forward to the most. Are we living in a post-Enlightenment era because of the transformative power of AI, as Henry Kissinger argued? Does the age of resolution necessarily portend darker times ahead? Is that the thesis, or might there be a silver lining to all this profound change? And if so, what is it? So without further ado, please join me in welcoming to the stage Fareed Zakaria and Eric Schmidt.
It's great to be back and see so many people we know. And I think Fareed does not need an introduction. Fareed, why did it take you 10 years to write this book? You produce a book every couple of years.
Right, so, when I say it took me 10 years, people should understand it. I did write 2 books along the way, and, about, I don't know, something like 500 columns and 500 television shows. So it's not like I was goofing off. So I started to think about it. Really, I remember the rise of the Tea Party making me realize something different is happening in American politics. And Theda Skocpol, a scholar at Yale, wrote this wonderful analysis of the Tea Party and pointed out that, in fact, while they talked about government spending, what they really cared about was immigration, multiculturalism, what we would now call the woke agenda. So it was all cultural issues that they were motivated by. And they were taking over the Republican Party, this party of the sort of Chamber of Commerce and bankers. And the second piece was that as the economy improved and as it became clear that we were coming out of the Great Recession better than any country in the world, any major economy, Obama's approval ratings were flatlining. They just were not moving. And historically, the single strongest predictor of a president's approval rating has been the state of the economy. And so here you were seeing these things kind of that normally go together were coming unstuck. So I started to think about it and asked myself, could it be that it's all this change that we're seeing, globalization, information revolution? And then I thought, okay, when has this happened in the past, in history? And in doing that, it just took me a long time to school myself in the Dutch revolt of the 16th century, the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, and to get the confidence that I had a plausible theory of the case. It was, it took me a year to read enough about the French Revolution to be sure I was where I was, and also watching, it seemed as though, in a way, I had been prescient enough that the book was going to be fine if it took a little longer. And the events were unfolding. Brexit happens, then Trump gets elected, and it all seems to confirm this idea that we're in a new politically revolutionary age.
Well, this is an incredible book, by the way. I've now read the early draft and now the final version. And it's interesting that you start with the Netherlands. Why? Well, who cares about the Netherlands? Right? Isn't it China, US, India, all that stuff?
So when I was on Colbert, I said, I'm very high on the Netherlands. And he said, yeah, we all are. So I hadn't quite thought about how to phrase the reference to the Netherlands. But it's actually an amazing story, because if you think about per capita GDP, average income throughout history, there's this wonderful graph that Angus Madison has that I borrow and put in the book. It basically, we can go back, we have decent data going back about 2,000 years, and it's flat lines. It's about $400 per capita GDP, inflation adjusted. So for 1,750 years, it's basically flatline. And then it starts to edge up, and then it's a hockey stick after the Industrial Revolution. That edging up is the rise of the Netherlands. It is the first country to break out of really millennia of poverty, stagnation, And the reason why it does it is the first country to experience a technological revolution, a globalization revolution that simultaneously then produce an identity revolution and a political revolution. So you start with the invention of tall ships and the ability to reclaim land, water management basically, which the Dutch do fantastically. Then they do incredible innovation in financial kind of structure. They create the first joint stock company, the Dutch East India Company, the largest company in the world at the time. They create the first stock market, and they become very quickly the richest country in the world. So by the end of the 17th century, Amsterdam is 4 times richer per capita than Paris, which was, in the old model, the richest city in Europe because it was a big agricultural country, vast estates. So the Dutch represent this extraordinary rise of technology defining power, urbanization defining power, not, you know, how much gold can you conquer from Latin America and bring home in bullion. And when they do this, it triggers an identity revolution because the Dutch now start to think of themselves as not part of the Habsburg Empire, not part of the great Catholic mass of Europe, but rather Protestant, Dutch, separate, and they revolt. And that Dutch revolt is really the beginning of the story of modern politics.
And what's interesting is that when you study history, it's all about, you know, the great leaders. But when you teach history, you teach it as much more bottoms up.
Yeah.
You know, I always like decentralized systems.
Yeah.
I don't like this sort of power model.
Yeah.
So that's why I particularly like your, but I don't think people agree with you. I mean, what's the insight that they don't get?
Well, you're right. I mean, to a certain extent, people like stories, and they like stories about people. And, you know, at some level, people don't want to believe that, you know, if there hadn't been William of Orange, some other Dutch leader would have come along and probably done something roughly the same. Now, there are moments in history where clearly leaders matter. Lincoln, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Napoleon, those are unique figures. But, you know, the broad trajectory of the Industrial Revolution was not going to change depending on who came in power. And the point you make is very important. The Netherlands benefits enormously from being decentralized. The large centralized economies of Europe, France, Spain, were not able to innovate. The Dutch were able to innovate because they had this completely decentralized structure where everybody competed with one another and everybody had to kind of collectively figure out ways to do things. The British have a similar structure, so it's not an accident that the next big economic leap happens in Britain. These are the parts of the Roman Empire that were the most loosely governed from Rome because they were the furthest away. And there's this wonderful book by a guy named Walter Schneider who points out that when the Roman Empire collapses, the parts that do best were the parts that were governed in a most decentralized fashion from Rome.
And it's interesting, in your book, you actually compare and contrast this with the French Revolution, which from your retelling, of course I wasn't there at the time, didn't go so well.
Yeah, Joe Biden was, but you weren't. Yeah, so the French Revolution is a perfect example of not a bottoms-up revolution, not a revolution of economics and technology modernizing a country, which then modernizes the politics, but rather a political elite deciding we are going to modernize the country. France was a completely agrarian, rural economy, largely extractive. No real innovations taking place at any of the levels I was talking about with the Dutch. But they had a very educated elite that, you know, thought that they were going to, and, you know, conceived of ideas like the rights of man and liberty, equality, and decided they were going to impose it on a very reluctant population. And the result was complete chaos. And by any standards, the French Revolution fails. I mean, it ends in Napoleon crowning himself emperor. So. But you can't possibly imagine a revolution designed to create democracy ending in an empire is a success.
So I've told you offline that I think that the 10 years, you ended up timing this thing perfectly.
Yeah.
And in the book, and on the various interviews you've been doing, you actually say that something very strange, my words, not yours, something very strange has occurred, which is all of these things have lined up right now against us,
Right.
we, whatever we are. And we don't know how to handle it because we don't have the historical context. What you say in various speeches is you have a technological revolution and you have this enormous number of people who've come to the middle class, globalization essentially. So has this occurred in the past, or is it just all occurring at once, and because we thought the arc of liberalism was always positive, we're like in shock?
Yeah. So, I mean, it is an enormous amount of change, right? Like, think about it's hard to imagine that we are living through revolutionary times because we think the times we're living through are normal. But, you know, just think of the last 30 or 40 years. You have the information revolution is really, I mean, you're at the center of it and created part of it. It's hard to overstate the importance, I believe, particularly socially and psychologically. We can have debates about what it does to total factor productivity and things like that. But think about how it changes the nature, the landscape of societies. You know, there was the entire basis of industrial economies for 250 years had been you work with your hands, you make things, you make atoms, and those atoms do the work, you know, do things in the economy. The Industrial Revolution was largely an energy revolution. And here now you come along and create this entire new world of bits and bytes and information, large parts of which are free. You know, how do you even think about that? You take something like the Encyclopedia Britannica, right? There were 110,000 copies sold every day. Now you have Wikipedia, which I think gets 5 billion people visiting every month, something like that. You know, so it's and the scale is so different. So we don't know how to think about it. Then you have globalization. So you had in the 50s, 60s, you had globalization expanding. So Japan came online, as it were. South Korea came online, Singapore, Malaysia. And then from about 1985, for the next 20 years, India, China, all of Latin America, most of Africa, the remnants of Asia, that's about 3 billion people coming online in 20 years. That's shock. And then you add to it the extraordinary social changes that have taken place. You know, take one that I think is, in my view, the most important, which is the rise of women. You know, throughout history, whatever society you look at, some people were on top, some were at the bottom. They might have been race, religion, whatever. But always, women were second-class citizens. You know, largely the property of men in most societies until 200 or 300 years ago. And then in the last 30 or 40 years, we fundamentally changed that. So you upend something that was at the heart, that was society's basic building block, which was the family. And now you're altering the power structure, the power dynamic within the family. These are huge changes to go through. Have we ever gone through anything quite like it? I think the closest would be, you know, 1880 to 1920, electricity, cars, telegraph, telephone, nationalism. But think about what it produces. It produces communism, fascism, World War. You know, so that's the scale of the change.
And it's interesting that in the book you don't particularly emphasize, for example, the American Revolution, which we of course have all learned here. You really are much more focused on this sort of bottoms-up technological societal change.
Exactly.
So you're consistent.
The American Revolution is basically a war of independence. Well, if you look at it from deep social revolutionary terms, nothing changes in the South. The structure of Southern, the agrarian economy and political structure with slaves stays entirely intact. Even in the North, the essentially feudal structure where a small number of aristocratic whites owned property and control over the economy and thus political influence was largely kept intact. There was an effort, you remember the Whiskey Rebellion, to have a kind of radical redistributive social revolution, and it's fought back, it's beat back. So it took a while, and the real changes in America happened, in my view, 1860 to 1880. The Civil War, which breaks the back of slavery, and then the Industrial Revolution, which produces a whole new elite, the so-called robber barons, which, you know, kind of forcibly modernizes the American economy and nationalizes it. You know, you have a national economy, and now you're forced to create a national government with things like the Interstate Commerce Clause, which allows you to say, okay, we are actually one economy.
And taxes and things like that.
Which is all, people forget, this was all largely either not done. I mean, it was unconstitutional in many ways. You know, people often quote Oliver Wendell Holmes' famous line, "Taxation is the price of civilization," which Jeffrey Sachs, associated with this university, has used as the title of his book. And I always applauded it. I was amused to note that when Oliver Wendell Holmes said that, the income tax was 1%. So we've come a long way.
So I want to ask sort of a strange compound question, because I'm still confused. You started with the Tea Party, and I did not understand that they were the progenitors of, I'll use the word MAGA and so forth.
Right.
And, and I never understood populism. Now maybe this audience does because it's a foreign policy tool, but it never made any sense to me. Right, I was taught over and over again that the arc of liberalism was positive, that society, when middle classes emerged, people wanted the same things. They wanted health and safety and education for their children, equality, that the benefits of immigration were high, you know, all of these things, things that I know you believe in, because I've obviously watched your show many times. Was all of this here and we never heard from them because we didn't have social media, which I'll come to in a sec? Or was it suppressed? Or were the newspapers not covering this movement? In other words, it feels like it just showed up.
Yeah.
What are its origins, and why are we dealing with this? This is an institution of learning, right? Presumably people here actually want to hear critical thinking and opposing views. Sorry.
It's a great question. So look, at some level, the broad sweep, the trajectory is that the working class for much of the 20th century was struggling to achieve a decent standard of living. You know, in Maslow's hierarchy, they were looking at food, shelter, housing, you know, health, that kind of thing. And part of what happens is we create a mass middle class in the Western world. And that mass middle class by the 70s starts to think about its goals as post-material, self-expressive. You know, now my political identity is defined not just by my economy, by my economic place, but by my cultural aspirations. Who am I as you know, my gender identity, my racial identity, my national origin identity, my sexual identity. All those things begin to come to the fore. At the same time, you have this accelerating change. And the change starts to make people very anxious. One of the things Tony Blair once said to me that I think is a profound insight is he said, people on the left don't understand that when human beings get very insecure and anxious, they don't move left economically, they move right culturally. In other words, when you go through this kind of turmoil of change, the left's instinct is, let me spend more money on you. Let me give you, you know, worker retraining, better health care. And not that we shouldn't do that. By the way, I do think we should do that. But the real anxiety people have is my world is disappearing. The world that I knew is disappearing. And they are looking for, and the people who understand this, and this was true in the 1880s and 90s with people like Bismarck and Disraeli, the right wing understands it better because what they say is, you know, you're part of one nation. We believe in God. We believe in family. And by the way, there's those others who you can define yourself by the fact that you're not these, you know, as Trump would say, dirty Mexicans or whatever it is he's talking. Think about Trump's message when he starts campaigning. It's basically, if those hour-long campaign speeches, you could boil down to 4 lines. The Chinese are taking away your factories. The Mexicans are taking away your jobs. The Muslims are trying to kill you. I will beat them all up, right? And it had nothing to do with the traditional Republican message of economics. It was fundamentally about culture. So I think part of it is that sweep. Now you ask a very good question, why now, what triggered it? You know, part of it is these things acquire a critical mass, but I do think that the 2008 financial crisis, more than we realize, had a huge impact. Steve Bannon once said to me that he thought the origin of Trumpism comes out of that, because it gave ordinary people in America, working class people in America, the feeling the system was rigged. This was not the most efficient way to run it. We were all told that this was the meritocracy. These guys knew how to do what they were doing. It turned out it was all a house of cards. And when it collapsed, they bailed themselves out and left us. You know, the idea of bailing out the banks, but not looking after the people whose mortgages were under, that was a very powerful asymmetry. And, you know, Tim Geithner, who was first at the Fed and then at Treasury, I think did an amazing job at bailing out the economy, but he himself says, we saved the economy, but we lost the country. Because the only way to save the economy was to really bail out the arsonists, right? Because you needed to get money pumping through the economy, and the financial system are the arteries of the economy. So you had to get that money flowing. But in doing that, you were bailing out the arsonists. And there was no way around it.
But I'm still confused. I agree with everything you just said. We've now become tribal in a way that America was never supposed to be. And it's true on both sides, by the way. I'm assuming the majority of this audience is liberal and not everyone. You're in a tribe too. Look at the messaging you get, right, from your favorite television shows, right, not from yours. What is tribal? So maybe I should ask the forward question. Have we gone from being one nation that is a mixing pot to a tribal country where we're going to be fighting each other on all these important and stupid issues all the time?
So first, let's remember. I'm always somebody who reminds us that our nostalgic views of the past are not entirely right. Whites in the South were voting their ethnic identity and being tribal for a long time, and they were being,
also known as being racist.
Right, exactly.
Okay,
and you know,
I can say it.
And blacks were being tribal, and you know, in a good sense, like collectively, you know, expressing their what power they had. So we've often had and people do tend to vote in blocks. You know, there's one of my favorite lines. Irving Kristol, the neoconservative intellectual, once said, he became conservative, and he said, "I'll never understand about my fellow Jews. We live like Episcopalians, but we vote like Puerto Ricans." And his point was, you know, and I think the answer is Jews have always known what it's like to be at the bottom, and so that memory stays very, very strong for Jewish Americans. But you're right. It's much more accentuated now, and it's much, much more. And the reason is when I think you start to think in these cultural terms, and you think of your identity as defined in those terms, culture, class, all these things layer one on top of the other. So we've become two Americas, really. One that is urban, educated, multicultural, and liberal, and the other which is rural, less educated, religious, white, and conservative.
So now we're about to have an election. You've been very critical of Trump. There's plenty of things to criticize on Biden. And my analysis is it's at the moment 50-50, so we don't know. Sketch the next decade with Trump as the next president. Sketch the next decade where Trump is not the next president, Biden is the next president. Does this correct? In other words, is this some aberration where everything came at once and we kind of work it out, which would be my hope? Or are there much more fundamental changes that we don't really understand are coming?
So look, it's the essential question. To me, this feels like one of the most consequential elections in American history. I know people say that often, but if you think back over the Cold War, really, if you think about American elections in that period, they weren't that consequential when you look back at it historically. If Nixon had won instead of Kennedy in 1960, it's very difficult to make the case it would have made some huge difference in American policy. You know, and you can go on. If Gore had won over Bush, maybe the Iraq War wouldn't have happened. But you know, if Kerry had won over Bush, these are much less consequential than the question of whether Trump wins, or it seems to me, because Trump does represent something that is he's fundamentally critical in a way of the kind of entire liberal democratic project and the constraints on power that it places, the norms that let's not forget, this is the first American president in history to actively try to seek to thwart the peaceful transfer of power. I forget about inciting the crowd outside the Capitol. What he did inside is even more important, which is he got a majority of House Republicans to vote against the certification of Joe Biden. And if they had been in a majority, Biden would not have been certified that election. That's a big deal. So it feels to me like if Trump gets elected, we do end up in a situation where there is real liberal democratic decay. Institutions decay, norms get eroded. I don't think it's the end of the world. You know, we've been through the Civil War, we've been through McCarthyism, but I think it's a major setback, and it encourages all kinds of people around the world, from the obvious ones like Orban, but I give you a simple one like Modi in India, who in his own way has been very illiberal. And one of the things that you know, Indian supporters of his will say when you talk about the way in which they're politicizing the judiciary, or look at America. Look at what, you know, we're only doing what the Americans do, and America is meant to be the city on the hill as far as liberal democracy is concerned. So I think it has a huge follow-on effect. Now, you know, in the longer run, look, I'm hopeful because I think that at the end of the day, the populists have no answers to the problems. You know, they don't actually have a solution that is going to work. And liberals, and I mean by liberals broadly, people who believe in liberty and rule of law and, you know, free speech and things like that, and I think that encompasses a lot of Republicans these days. Ultimately, that will prevail, but the biggest thing the left has to understand is you can't overdo it, you can't press too far, too fast, and you can't use illiberal means to achieve liberal ends. So if you want racial equality, you don't thrust it down people's throat, you don't do it by decree, you try to do it by persuasion, and you don't start to use race to combat racism. You know, ultimately we should remember, even something like affirmative action is a path to a colorblind society. We don't want a situation where everybody is constantly divvied up and counted and tabulated on the basis of these ascriptive qualities. Okay, we have to deal with injustice in the past, but the goal is that, you know, Hamlet can be played by a black actor and Othello can be played by a white actor. That should be our goal.
And Google's AI will generate that outcome for you.
Yeah, the problem is whether or not people will accept that.
In your book, you actually talk a lot about the backlashes of revolutions. So if I take your framing, so let's think about affirmative action, which I was very much in favor of. You could have imagined affirmative action with an agreed upon end date, right, and then you could renew it. Right. So part of the political problem is that advocates who feel strongly, and in many cases rightly, are not willing to moderate their claim. You know, it's what they do every day, their identity, and so forth. So to me, that strikes me as a governance and a human problem. And it's true, by the way, on both sides. I learned a long time ago that people who were advocating the things that they wanted me to do at Google, they never stopped, right? I would give them an answer and they would ask again and again and again because their job was to be advocates, right? And advocacy is a good thing. No, so how do you build a consensus of what the limit should be so that you don't provoke the backlash? So if you can look at the horrific decision, sorry to editorialize, on the abortion stuff from the Supreme Court, that's a backlash, right? How could we have avoided that?
Right. So it's a great question, and it seems to me that one of the challenges is precisely as you say, how do you create an institutional structure where you are aiming for certain ends, but that you don't then create institutions that are permanent, that constantly advocate for this. So, you know, I mean, look at universities. All the DEI bureaucracy that has been built comes out of a very good place. It comes out of trying to take people who are excluded and marginalized. But in my opinion, at least, when you have these bureaucracies, they exist to make the case that people are instead marginalized, excluded, and, you know, at some level they can't take yes for an answer because that means they should be funded less. When I was on the Yale Corporation, I used to argue that it's fine every time there was a problem, every one of these groups would ask for more money. You know, African American, Latino, you know. And my point was, this further segregates the campus and makes people think of themselves in tribal ways. Why don't we create more money to integrate the campus? to make these groups talk to one another, to remind us what we share in common. But of course, you've created an institutional bureaucracy that has to keep going in this direction. And so you have to remember that your goal at some level is not to have a DEI bureaucracy, that your goal is not to have affirmative action. Your goal, and if you forget that, I think, and you get so impatient that you insist that it be done by decree. You know, Roe is a good example of this. Abortion was getting liberalized in the 50 states, and if you had gone through a political process of argumentation and persuasion, America would probably end up where Europe is today, which is there were no Roe v. Wade, but most European countries have, roughly speaking, as I understand it, about 12 to 15 weeks is. Instead, what we ended up with was this decree from on high, which largely fueled the right, particularly the Christian right, led to decades of conservative governance from Ronald Reagan onwards, and has never quite gotten resolved politically because nobody was trying to persuade the other. Each was saying, I'm going to take the court and I'm going to simply decree it.
I'm going to ask one final question, then we'll move and ask the Dean Karan, to come on up. This is not really about the book, okay? So because of what you do, you talk to all of the world's leaders, probably more than most world leaders. And it's pretty clear that there's this huge fight between the US and China. There's obviously a war in Ukraine and Russia. And obviously we see the rise of India, and you were recently in India, and of course your family is Indian.
We were in India together.
Indeed, and we had a great trip. What does the structure of the world look like again, I'll ask the 5 or 10 year question.
Right.
So give us the privilege of hearing you just guess, right? Who are the winners?
Well, it's absolutely clear who the top winner is. The United States is probably more dominant on core metrics of hard power than, I would argue, you could almost argue it, than it has ever been. Certainly the period after 1945 to 60 would perhaps be the exception, when the rest of the world lay in ruins. But look at, so in one of the reasons I like the Dutch is Angus Madison, the great economic historian, says the way to tell modern power is who is the lead technology power in the world. And he says there have only been 3. From 1880, it has been the United States. Before that, for about 150 to 200 years, it was Britain. Before that, it was the Netherlands. If you looked at, believe it or not, back to the, by the way, for 500 years, they've been basically in the top 10 countries of the world. Not a bad achievement. You know who the largest agricultural exporter in the world, of course, is the United States. Do you know the second largest agricultural exporter in the world is Netherlands, with 17 million people? Do you see my point? And on that tiny plot of land, how do they do it? So if you look at technology, I don't have to tell you, the US is more dominant than we have ever been. If you had asked in 1980, what are the top technology companies in the world, there would have been a bunch of American companies. There would have been a lot of Japanese companies on there. There would have been Japanese car companies, Mitsubishi, the consumer electronics probably had some German companies, a Dutch company, Philips. Today, it's all American, right? If you look at the top technology companies in the world, they are all American. Looking forward, artificial intelligence, biotech, it's all happening in America. This has really never happened. And the scale of that achievement can be just summarized by saying those top, they call the 7 big technology companies in America. You take their market cap, and it is larger than the market capitalization of the entire countries of Britain, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, and Canada put together. Britain, France, Germany, Canada put together. Apple's market cap is larger than that of the German stock market. And Germany is the 3rd or 4th largest country in the world. So we're off the charts. If you look at this extraordinary element of power that gets unnoticed, we are the biggest energy superpower in the world. We make more oil than Saudi Arabia. We make more natural gas than Qatar. And we are basically beginning to dominate the green energy space as well. You look at finance. Our banks are the biggest, most dominant, most systemically important in the world. The dollar is the reserve currency of the world. And finally, you say, looking forward, every rich country in the world is basically going to look like Florida, except the United States. I don't mean aesthetically. The Europeans would be horrified at that prospect. But I mean demographically, every rich country in the world is becoming a retirement society, except the US, because we take in more immigrants every year, 1 million legal immigrants, than the rest of the OECD put together. That immigration gives the United States a much better demographic profile than any of the advanced industrial countries, and of course, much better than Europe, which is much better than China, sorry, which is in demographic freefall. So you put all this together, and yes, I know, the big limiting factor is our politics is totally screwed up. But it's very hard to see a better hand that anybody has to play than the US.
Thank you, Fareed. Dean?
I believe we have an agreement. We have to start a center for the study of the Netherlands. This was fantastic. Congratulations, Fareed. This is a terrific, incredible book. So we can go for hours. We received so many questions from our students, from our faculty. So we have time for, unfortunately, only 4. And they are for both of you. First question from our student. What are the biggest breakthroughs you foresee that AI will make?
I think that's fair.
I don't want to take away from Fareed's enormous day here. A simple summary is another big thing is about to happen that nobody seems to understand. Today, these large language models go from language to language. I hope you all are using them. I assume the university doesn't really know you're using them. But that's not the power. The power is when you can say what you want and the system can write programs to make it happen. And it's likely that in the next 4 or 5 years, every human on the planet will be able to say roughly into their phone what they want. It'll get transcribed into their language. That language will get translated into code, typically Python, and the Python will then execute whatever they want. It's likely, for example, that you can say, hey, I don't really like the way Google works, which I obviously do. I want my own Google. I want you to build me a search engine, and I want you to organize the data this way, and I want you to have my prioritization. It's an enormous shift of power that I don't think anyone quite understands, and it's happening very fast.
So Fareed, from your perspective, you write a lot about AI too in the book. So how do you envision it as part of this current revolution?
So I'm going to leave the science part of it to Eric, and I agree with what he said. What he was basically describing, as we've talked about, is a text-to-action model rather than a text-to-text right now, right? When you ask ChatGPT a question and you're amazed, oh, it can write a poem, it can do, but the real, when it controls software that controls hardware that does stuff, run my airport more efficiently or something. To me, the biggest the social things that I worry about are, first, I think the scale of AI, the disruption, as Eric is describing, is just going to be huge. And I think there's no getting around the fact that it is going to be very complicated from an employment point of view. That the fundamental thing that AI is doing right now in all these programs that they are using is you can do the same work better with fewer people, many fewer people. And you can see this in almost every experiment they're doing. So, I know that in the long run, we create new jobs and new opportunities. I hope it's not the too long run, because it could be very disruptive.
But by the way, I need to tell you, I was meeting with a young woman who's a computer scientist, and I said, what is your plan? And she said, I'm going to leave and found a company. And I said, what's going to be about? And I said, I know one thing. I'm only going to have myself as the employee. And I said, really?
Yeah.
I mean, I thought, think about that, right? You found a company, and technically they'll do it with agents, and the agents can do a lot of different things. It doesn't quite work yet, so she's still working on the computer science. But directionally, Fareed is correct.
And the second piece that I worry about is, and this is something Eric wrote about in that, which is really the definitive book on AI. We need to understand how AI works. It cannot just be a black box. You know, and the truth is most of the people working on it right now don't understand how it works. They do not understand how the neural networks get to the answers they do, what weights they are assigning, what the decision-making process is. Because if you don't, you have a black box with enormous power, and you take us back to a kind of pre-Enlightenment world where in the past, you know, when it rained or there was a thunderstorm, we didn't know why it happened, so we said God made it happen. So now we're going to go to a model where we don't know why this is happening. AI tells us it's happening. So, you know, you'll have somebody who will be told, you have cancer. And they'll say, well, how do you know that? We don't know. The box is telling us, but you have cancer. We, in order to trust it, and I think that so much will depend on this, the ability to trust depends on understanding what is the mechanism. And we're, you know, and I know that people at OpenAI certainly, that Sam told me, are working on this to try to kind of understand it themselves.
Yeah. All right, so another question, not so much on just AI, but also social media. So Facebook, Twitter, and other social media applications played a critical role in the Arab Spring revolutions. What role do you think, both of you, AI and social media, will play in future revolutions and coups d'etats, if any? What is kind of front and center for you, Fareed, on this?
Well, let me start, and then I'd love to hear Eric's thoughts on it. Look, I think that what social media has shown actually is the limits of its power in terms of in the revolutionary sense. So it may have incited or allowed the Arab Spring to kind of bubble up and spread a little bit further. But don't forget, every country that had an Arab Spring is now firmly under the control of a dictatorship. So the Arab Spring is largely notable for its complete failure. And what that reminds you is that it's not enough to like something on Facebook or even to retweet. Or, you know, this is not social organization. This is not political power. When you think about the movements that changed societies, you know, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, there's a lot of hard work and suffering and sacrifice and getting out there and confronting power with force and truth. That's what you have to do. And social media in some ways, frankly, just gives you the illusion that you are in some way participating, you are politically active. But as far as I can tell, it's, you know, to the extent it has an impact, it's deleterious because it silos you, it puts you into your tribe, it makes you feel self-righteous and virtuous. Look at these new congressmen and congresswomen who basically are so extreme that they want no compromise on anything. The Republicans with a 2-seat majority are acting as though they can, you know, they can block everything in government. You know, it's like, there needs to be some kind of come to Jesus moment. Guys, you have a 2-seat majority. But why does that not happen? Because there's about 25 of them, younger, fresh, you know, congressmen, whose goal is not actually to govern the United States. Their goal is not to arrive at legislation that solves a problem, even a problem like passing a budget. Their goal is to become famous on Twitter and Facebook and raise funds by doing that. And by that logic, they're succeeding admirably. So to my mind, social media has been largely negative in political social organization.
I worry about algorithmic boosting. I'm strongly in favor of free speech, including hate speech, and in particular speech I disagree with, and I was taught that as a young person at university. And I'm worried that these systems are organized around boosting the most emotional, the most extreme, and that they are the sort of core driver of the underlying dissent and anxiety and tribalism that we feed. Jonathan Haidt's book is out this week. Another extraordinary book, talks about its impact on young people. He's got all the data.
But isn't the economics in those social media companies, the model is to do that?
Absolutely,
that's what
because they make more money, and they're good capitalists. And so I think it's, and in our book, which Fareed, you know well, with Henry Kissinger, we talked a lot about how the systems that affect the information space should not be given complete control to, sorry, wrong sentence, but you shouldn't let the tech bros control the US information space. That's roughly what we said.
Exactly.
Henry didn't know what a tech bro was, but that's what he meant to say.
Yeah. Next question. also from a SIPA student, what practical advice would you give to students attempting to envision a world beyond the chaos of today's news cycle? What does it take to imagine change?
My answer is found a company to change something you don't like. And you may disagree, so I'll say something obnoxious. Thanks to Fareed and a bunch of other people, I hang out with all these foreign policy people.
Yeah.
And they're so much better spoken than I am, and they write so much better. And I listen to them and I go, you go. You're right, and nothing happens, okay? And then they write another book, and they analyze it, and they're so impressive, and I just love it, and nothing happens. So find a way, at whatever scale you can operate at, to change something. So Fareed had a specific suggestion, which was finding mechanisms for people to talk to each other. That's his idea, right? Maybe you have company ideas or product ideas or religious ideas, or you're found a new belief system, or you're going to write a new doctrine or something. But you have to do it as opposed to discuss it.
I largely agree with that, but I would say, how do you think about what is the goal? What are you trying to imagine? I think the most important thing is to remember, it's a little bit like raising children. It's never as great as you thought it was, and it's never as bad. So whenever there's a problem, just remember, it will pass. So don't get so traumatized by the current moment that you cannot imagine a different moment, because you know what? Nothing lasts forever. Take something like even Trump. I assume many people here are just as dismayed as I am. Look, he looks younger than Biden, but he's not a lot younger. And to a certain extent, this has become a kind of, the weirdness of Trump. There's the populism that I talk about, obviously, that I think is deep-rooted, but there's also the kind of, total abnormality and weirdness of Donald Trump, right? That will pass. I mean, at some level, the Republican Party has been taken over by a family cult. I mean, think about the last Republican convention. There was no party platform. There was a one-paragraph statement that said whatever Trump says is the party platform. There were no former presidents who were invited. There were no former presidential nominees who were invited. But 5 members of the Trump family had primetime speaking slots at the convention. This is not normal. And this will probably not last. I assume that at some point we get back to a more normal politics.
But also going back to your book, I mean, the issue of polarization what about students getting outside their silos and the echo chambers that you were talking about?
Well, this is where I think universities really have to recommit themselves to a fundamentally open space where, I think my colleague Van Jones at CNN put it very well. At universities, you want students to be physically safe and intellectually unsafe. It should be an unsafe place. It should be a place where you encounter dangerous, radical ideas that you have to then think through, and you have to talk to the actual human being who holds these ideas. I think we would all benefit from more time spent talking to actual Trump voters. And I don't mean the kind we probably know who are sort of rich bankers who secretly are voting for Trump because they hope their taxes are going to get cut. I mean the people out there who really, for whom this is a core identity. What is motivating them? What is it? Have a conversation, and we do so little of that at university because it's become this comforting bubble of kind of self-congratulation. And there are these departments, I have to confess, that I worry a lot about where there is only a right answer.
Oh, yeah.
I'm all in favor, as I said, I think the emancipation of women has been the most important thing we've done. But a gender studies department, can you have a tenured faculty member who says, actually, in this case, I don't think gender discrimination was a big deal? No, that is the wrong answer. There can't be wrong answers in a university. There have to be, everything has to be explored.
You did say that the polarization in the country is rural and less educated, and then urban and more educated. That's very dangerous, because it means you have an entire belief system in 2 different parts of the country that are roughly split 50-50.
And the geography, class, culture, religion, all layer one on top. You know what I mean? Each are self-reinforcing. So The multiculturalism also means they tend to be more secular. They tend to live in urban areas. They tend to be richer. The other ones tend to be poorer, less educated, rural, more white.
Yeah.
It's a terrible, when you had what political scientists call cross-cutting cleavages, it was much, much better. When you could be somebody who was, as Irving Kristol said, white and Jewish and rich, and yet your political identity was with the party of the poor, and that was a much better, where you have many identities, and your identities don't all fit in one bucket. Now our identities all fit in one bucket.
So the last question, because what we don't want to happen is to leave people more anxious and depressed about the future. So we learned a lesson. So let me end by asking you both, what gives you hope in the world's future?
So when I look at it, the American experiment is incredible because everything you said about technology leadership is correct. And the science leadership that we're going to see across our country and in the West, and followed by China and others, is profound. Cures to terrible diseases, solutions to climate change, new energy solutions. I can go on and on. Material science, the revolution that's happening in the science sides of these universities is profound. When I spend time with the students, they're so smart, I almost cry. Right? They're literally, they're sort of ready to get their Nobel Prize, and they're 23 years old. They're that good. So at the end of the day, they will save us.
Yeah, that's great. Fareed? Yeah.
Look, I have 3 kids, so maybe I have a biased view on this. But I think one of the things that the memes that is out there that I really disagree with is that this generation is all coddled and woke, and they don't want to work. I think, look, there's a certain amount of silliness that always happens in college. When I was at college, there were a bunch of people who were Maoist revolutionaries. I mean, there were people, the Harvard Crimson editorialized in favor of Pol Pot when he took over Cambodia.
These are all now working in New York in
they're all working for you or Goldman Sachs. They all, the people now, and young people today, they say all this stuff, and then they go out and where do they apply? McKinsey, Goldman, and Google. So it's these are not people who are trying to burn the house down. But more importantly, I think, where some of that energy comes from, it's a good place. What we're trying to do in this country, and in the Western world more generally, is something very unusual, which is to create a universal nation, to create a nation where people come from all parts of the world, have all kinds of ethnicities, all kinds of skin colors, all kinds of religions, all kinds of, political affiliations, and they're all represented. That's what's different. No one has to suppress their identity. No one has to hide. No one has to stay in the shadows, whether you're gay or straight or Latino or white. And in trying to make that happen, it's a struggle, and it's a little unsettling to people. But think about the goal. I mean, imagine, and by the way, the U.S. is far ahead in this respect. If you look at Europe, it may be politically more liberal than America, but socially, Europe is a much more conservative place. When you look at, and you can see this in female representation on boards. I remember going to France and talking to a bunch of French, brown-skinned Muslims, and one of them said to me, the simplest way to explain the difference between France and the United States is we have the same number of people who look like us in both countries, but there's nobody like Fareed Zakaria in France. Right? And what they meant was more broadly that they're, in the kind of establishment, those people are much, much less. And now it's changing in Europe as well. But I think that, we're trying to do something it's a thrilling adventure to try to create this universal nation. It's bumpy along the way. There's stresses and strains. But, I wouldn't trade this time for any. I think we're going through technologically, economically, politically, some incredible changes with incredible upsides. But the danger of the upsides is that they are disruptive, and so you have to manage the downsides. I think we will navigate through it, and maybe I'm an immigrant, so I always have to think that, I'm in a sense justifying my decision of moving here all those years ago.
Just remember, in the Hamilton play, it says immigrants do it better.
Yes.
Can we thank SIPA, IGP, Dean,
Thank you.
Aaron, your entire group for making this happen, and Fareed, of course, you're the master.
Oh,
thank you so much. Thank you for. Fareed, thank you for writing this book. And Eric, it's always a pleasure to have you. This was a wonderful conversation, and thank you for joining us. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yes, let's take a...